Podcasting from a secret location deep inside the political colossus. This is Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance.
Part of the beauty of me is that I'm very rich. Let me tell you, I'm a really smart guy.
What's your name again? John Miller. And you work with Madhouse? Yes, that's correct.
Oh my God, they've got a madman on their hands.
We will have no truce nor parley with you or the grisly gang who work your wicked will. You do your worst, and we will do our best.
We've come to a turning point, a moment for hard decisions. If not us, who? And if not now, when?
It's 11:59 at Radio Free America, and this is Uncle Sam with music and the truth until dawn. Right now, I got a few words for some of our brothers and sisters in the occupied zone. The chair is against the walls. The chair is against the walls.
This is Radio Free GOP with your host, Mike Murphy.
We are here, the voice of the Republican resistance. I'm Mike Murphy, and we are podcasting from yet another secret location, this one very much close to the center of things in politics, our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. We're going to be talking about Donald Trump's big pivot to absolutely nothing new, and the Senate races. The big crush is afoot. We're going to offer a little advice and a little analysis there for Republicans feeling the Trumpian squeeze. And in our interview, we're going to talk to Democratic pollster Mark Mellman, an old pro who's going to tell us what to believe and what not to believe in the deluge of polls we're going to be facing in the next few weeks. An interesting topic, so let's get to it.
He used to have a big career, but now he's had enough. Podcasting's like therapy. His shrink says it's great stuff. Radio Free GOP.
Who would have thunk it? The Orange Menace appears to have his feelings hurt. I couldn't believe it. I read a fascinating TikTok piece by the New York Times reporting team of Burns and Haberman. Sounds like a DWI law firm. But they did a good job. They got inside the staff zeitgeist of the Trump campaign, and the basic storyline on the piece, if you didn't see it, was that Trump is raging in frustration at his advisors. He knows things are not going well, and of course he's blaming them for giving him bad advice, saying that if he'd only kept doing things his way, things would be better for the campaign right now. The problem is I can't tell what's changed. If anything, Trump has gotten worse by being more Trumpian. He's gone off the deep end more and more. What that great advice is the campaign has been giving him that's backfiring, I have no idea. I think it's been a pivot to nowhere. But Trump clearly feels that the advice is wrong, and he's going to do something about it, maybe revert to an even purer version of whatever he thinks got him there. That will be entertaining. I can tell you this. When campaigns start losing, it's a feedback loop. The external stimuli get worse and worse. Bad polls, bad feedback, endorsers don't show up. I remember once in the Dole primary in 87, the senator, a great American, was waiting for a key endorsement after he lost the New Hampshire primary from Ambassador Gene Kirkpatrick, a hero of the conservative movement in foreign policy. I was around that campaign. I remember when the phone call came about Kirkpatrick being unable to attend the big rally to endorse Senator Dole later that day. It turns out she had a dental emergency. I'd never heard the dental emergency excuse before, but what few supporters Trump has that are public, I predict are going to start having severe dental problems and not show up for events. It's all part of the compounding. Bad polls equal bad staff morale, equals stories in the media with unnamed sources close to the staff talking about how the candidate won't take their brilliant advice, the candidate screaming lies, 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 don't believe these lies, the staff fighting among themselves, the polls getting worse. It all folds in upon itself. Now, generally, there's only one way out of something like this, and it's always a long shot, and I predict something like this will happen. The campaign will try to make a big move, the fabled big idea theory of politics. Throw the long bomb, do something amazingly huge that'll electrify the country and change everything. Generally, these are suicide moves. Whenever the campaign's in so much trouble that the only way to get out of it is to throw common sense aside and do something so crazy, so big, it'll change everything, beware the outcome. Remember Palin, Sarah? That was another big move that turned out to be a big mistake. So we'll see, but I think if there's ever a time when the big move merchants do well, it's when a campaign is crumpling within itself. I think Trump ultimately has two options. Either drop out of the race, which I still think there is a chance of in mid-September. I don't think he wants to be America's biggest loser for much longer. He's a pouty guy, and you could kind of in Trumpology see a few hints about it's all fixed against him. He doesn't need this. He can always go back to building Scottish golf courses that locals hate. You can see him laying a few seeds and divine a bit of a window into how he's thinking. But if he doesn't get out, we're definitely heading for the other option, a big move. Now, I have no idea what it is. My guess is the big move will be something flashy. I don't know if it'll be a new hair color, gold-plated bus tour, something more conventional, or my personal favorite, and I have to admit the one I'm hoping for, he'll reach back into the campaign history book and pull out a big move that we haven't seen in American politics for a long time. I'm talking about the candidate telethon. That's right. Campaigns used to do telethons, and they'd have celebrity guests show up, and they'd interview each other. There'd be pledges for money. I think Trump may try a TV spectacular. That would be something. I'd probably pay to see it. That's right. 24 hours of Donald Trump on a stool with celebrity guests. Scott Bio, I'm sure, is available. It'll seize the attention of the country, and I think probably help Trump go out with an enormous splash. I really don't know what they're due, but they have to do something because the only real choices they have in the grinder they are in is Trump either drops out of the race in a pouty explosion of paranoia, rage, and finger-pointing, or they bust a big move to recapture attention and reclock the campaign and hopefully get the focus back on Hillary Clinton, who is wisely more or less in the witness relocation program, letting Trump tear himself apart. I don't know what it'll be, but something big is coming. Now, meanwhile, back in the semi-real world, the Republican senators are in a crusher all their own. We're running a bunch of senators for re-election, good people, all of them, who hold the key to whether Republicans or Democrats have the majority after Election Day. This is big stuff, and many of these senators come from blue-leaning states. In other words, in a normal election, the Democrats would have an advantage at the presidential level, let alone in the situation we're in now with the Orange Menace. So folks like Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire, Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, or Mark Kirk in the very tough-to-win state of Illinois are all looking at a crusher that is pretty daunting. Do they stick with Trump, who's going to get wiped out in their states, or do they cut him loose and get a little distance? Mark Kirk's already done that. He's probably got the toughest race, at least generically, and I saw some polling that showed that helped him, although he's still in an uphill climb. But Toomey and Ayotte and Johnson are still staying in the Trump corner. Now, they're bobbing and weaving. They're kind of not for Trump, not against Trump, ask me about anything other than Trump. The problem with that strategy is it pretty much manages, in the long term anyway, to offend everybody. The problem is Trump is just too big a factor to ignore. You can't pretend he doesn't exist. It's like holding a quaint little street fair half a block away from a stadium having an all-day-long heavy metal Metallica concert. You can't pretend it's not there while you talk about your interesting dream catchers and Hummel paintings. So here they are, these senators in a vice. And politicians hate being in a vice. But I think it's actually simpler than it appears. They've got to pick between two rough futures, both risky. But which is better? Do they offend all their suburban swing voters who abhor Trump and go down with that disadvantage? Or do they offend some of their Republican voters, and not all, by the way, just some? Are those voters suddenly going to not pull the Republican lever in a Senate race because the guy at the top of the ticket got a little distance from Trump? I think it's the safer bet, and they ought to be doing it. The problem is, like most politicians, there will be huge temptations and incentives to wait till it's too late. But the problem is, if Trump has set his hair on fire and totally blown up by mid-October, and they wait to walk away from Trump till that late, they get no credit for it. Always better to lead a parade than follow it. One of the big mistakes we make over and over again in the Republican Party is we confuse base voters with swing voters. They are not. So the moment is coming soon. In another few days, our great American athletes will pack up all those gold medals they won, amazing for a nation of losers, and leave Rio, probably stopping at the police station to fill out one last robbery report. Then the focus will come back to the presidential race. And that's when things are really going to pick up again. And that, I believe, is the moment for some of these candidates to take a walk on the Donald. In fact, because we love good government here, we'll even give you the radio-free GOP voice of Republican resistance, just add water, walk away from Trump kit. use the Olympics after the Olympics and talk about, insert candidate name here, how your family and you and your loved ones were watching the Olympics, seeing the multicultural celebration of our great athletes competing, underlining the special values and virtues that make America unique and special. Upon that reflection, seeing our country united in these divisive times, it's just impossible to cast a vote or to endorse Donald Trump and the rhetoric he's been espousing. Voters in my state will be free to do whatever they want, but personally, I'm not endorsing Donald Trump. I'm pulling the endorsement I might have made in the past, and I'm just not going to vote for him. I'm going to try instead to be the best senator, congressman, governor, dog catcher that this great state has ever had. And I hope you judge me on my accomplishments and my vision, not the candidate I think many of us agree now does not deserve to be in the Oval Office. And then stop talking. The point is, the end of the Olympics is going to be a high point in national unity and pride. What better time to ditch the Donald?
Mike Murphy, podcasting sanity, Radio Free GOP.
Before I get to the ads, I just want to quickly say thank you to all our listeners. Thanks for the great ratings on iTunes. Thanks for spreading the word. Thanks for sharing our podcast with your friends. We have been rocketing up the ratings. We are now, believe it or not, regularly in the top 10 on the iTunes list of top political podcasts. So thank you for that. We'll keep working hard to give you a podcast you enjoy and hopefully learn something from. Now, on to the advertising. I'm going to start with our initial advertiser, the great Private Equity Fundcast. We're grateful to them. Let me tell you about it. The Private Equity Fundcast is a weekly podcast hosted by Jim Milbury and Devin Matthews. They're partners in a Chicago-based private equity firm. Devin and Jim have spent the better part of the last 15 years buying and managing mid-market technology companies. The Fundcast draws from their collective experiences to pull back the veil on private equity, to give you a look inside, just like we do here about politics on Radio Free GOP. They talk about everything from the 7 deadly sins of private equity to the good, the bad, and the ugly of board meetings. So if you're the founder or owner of a business, if you work in management for a private equity-backed company, or maybe you provide services to private companies as an investment banker, lawyer, or accountant, or like some of us, you just like to geek out on private equity, then you should subscribe to the Private Equity Fundcast on iTunes or Google Play. I have, and it's very interesting stuff if you're in the business world. One more time, that's the Private Equity Fundcast on iTunes or Google Play. Radio Free GOP is also partially, because they're so cheap, brought to you by my friends at Ricochet.com. They are the most civil, center-right discussion community on the web. No trolls guaranteed. You can sign up, you get to be part of the community, and they distribute about a dozen really good podcasts, and then, of course, also this one. It's all there on Ricochet.com. It's $5 a month. You get a lot, and if you let them know you're a Radio Free GOP listener, the first month is free. All you got to do is go to ricochet.com/join. That is ricochet.com/join. Now, we also have our website, radiofreegop.com, which is basically a cornucopia of commerce. There's a little Amazon button with the Amazon logo on our website. You click that, go on Amazon, and blow all your money. I mean, I'm talking college, savings fund, everything. And a little bit of what you spend, your price stays the same, but a little bit of what you spend to Mr. Bezos is kicked back to us to, as we say in Philadelphia, get our beak wet. Helps pay the overhead around here. We also have, yes, we're this pathetic, we have a PayPal button where you can give us directly $1 or $2 or $3 that ship into the kitty, or you can take the fashion route. That's what most of the supermodels are doing. And buy one of our amazing American-made t-shirts, available in both rebellious white and subtle yet dignified navy blue. Both have our groovy logo on the front. They're limited editions. We've only printed a small amount, and they're almost sold out. We're printing a few more. Be the first in your neighborhood to have one. They're all on the website. You can do it there at radiofreegop.com. All right, back to work.
It's number 1 for rumors and fun. It's Resistance Podcasting, Radio Free GOP.
I'm Casey Kasem, and you're listening to Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance. Why am I reading about a resistance coming out of a fucking up-tempo record? The record is up-tempo. The stinger should be down. Why am I coming out with something get Bill on the line? No, I'm not going to do this with a fucking engineer. Get Bill on the line. We're trying to write fucking copy. I'm reading copy that's written by some intern, and you expect me to run a fucking resistance on the podcast? Get Bill on the line. This is crap. I'm not reading crap. And who the is Mike Murphy? Who is this guy?
Fight for sanity in this crazy year on Radio Free GOP.
Our interview today is with an old friend of mine. He's a Democrat, I'm a Republican. We disagree on everything. I'm right, he's wrong. But he's a patriot, he loves his country, and he has done a lot of Democratic campaigns. I think he's the best pollster on the D side. He's a good strategist, he's got some insight, and we're going to do a little discussion not only of great old political stories, but of what to look for at political polling, what the strengths are, the weaknesses, what to believe and what not to. We're going to go behind the veil, behind the numbers, and I think have a pretty interesting conversation. So here's my chat with Democratic super pollster, Mark Mellman.
It's time to ask some questions and go behind the scenes. Here's our latest interview. We'll try to keep it clean. Radio Free GOP.
Thanks for doing this, Mark.
Pleasure to be with you, Mike, as always.
So I've got to start with the first question I ask every political hack. How did you get into this?
Purely serendipitously. I was a high school kid, interested in politics around the time of riots in Ohio State University in the 70s. And so candidate for governor needed people to go door to door, but they could not get college students because no one would open their door to some long-haired, dangerous-looking college students. So we high school students were the people that went and knocked on doors.
Because you had that clean junior Republican look back then.
Exactly. I had to have my hair cut, dress code at the old high school. But anyway, we knocked on doors, and I got involved in politics that way. But really, professionally, I was really a graduate student in political science, and someone called a fellow in my department and said, I'm an unknown legal aid lawyer. I want to run for Congress against an incumbent. I have no chance. Will you help me? And he said, well, I can't because I have a contract with Newsweek, but I know somebody that might. Called me, gave me the same line. I said, well, I might do it, but I'm going to charge you for it. $2,000 for my services for the 2-year cycle. He said, well, I don't know about that. And he hung up. But some weeks later, we agreed on that $2,000. And when the Congressional Quarterly did a list of like 120 competitive races, we weren't on it, but we won anyway. So it's a big upset.
So you had that famous lightning bolt upset. Next thing you know, you're a political pollster and consultant.
Absolutely. I was the next cycle. I worked for Al Gore in his first Senate race, for Carl Levin in his Senate race, and a number of House races out of my bedroom in New Haven, Connecticut.
Oh, that's unbelievable. I like the fact you were the groovy professor in the corduroy jacket, diving into the world of politics. You're from Ohio, too. I'm from Michigan, so
yes,
we're kind of from the same region.
And longtime rivals.
Yeah, no.
Yes.
We've been at each other's throats for years and years. I'm following the Stuart Stevens thing of yet another rapprochement here.
Yes.
We've actually been friends for a long time because we never compete for business.
Exactly.
You're
right.
over on the communist side. I'm with the reactionary right, and we.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's been a fun many years. So what I thought we would talk about, in addition to good political hack stories, is polling. Because I'll be walking through an airport, and somebody will say, oh, you're one of those jerks on cable television, and come up to me and say, nobody's ever polled me. Or how do you believe that? How can you call 400 people and know what's going on? So, groovy Professor Mellman, can you walk us through a little bit, one, how it all really works, and two, what to believe and maybe what not to? Because there's a lot of junk polling out there. We both talk about this.
Absolutely. Look, the basic principle is this. If you went to the doctor's office and had your blood tested, thank God they don't have to take all of your blood, right? They take a sample, and that sample of your blood gives a pretty good indication of what the rest of your blood looks like for cholesterol and so on. Same thing is true with the public. If you draw a random sample of the public, there's all kind of math. We could fill the board with equations there to prove that if you draw a random sample of the public, a relatively small sample of that public can tell you a lot about the public as a whole. So there's two tricks, though. One is it has to be a random sample of the public, point one. And that gets violated all the time because not everybody's equally willing to talk. Not everybody's equally reachable. There's lots of things one has to do to try and make sure you have a random sample of the people who are going to vote, which is the second subpoint, is who's actually going to vote. The second big category is you have to ask the questions in a way that's meaningful, that's going to get give you results that are actually accurate.
Right. If you know that Donald Trump can scale tall buildings in a single bound, I guess I'd vote for him. He's Superman.
And it can be even much more subtle than that. There was, many years ago, a study done in Connecticut that showed that whether you asked the presidential race first or the Senate race first made a huge difference in how people voted in the Senate race in a particular state.
How they voted on the poll.
How they voted on the poll, whether they were asked on the poll, the Senate race question first or the presidential race first, made a big difference in terms of how they voted on the poll in the Senate race. So again, lots of technical issues here about how to develop questions, develop questionnaires, what the order should be, et cetera. You got a lot of things can go wrong when you're putting together a poll.
Well, that answer alone is worth the $2,000. So I think the guy got a bargain, because that's what I hear pollsters talk about. And I'm a big consumer of polling. I buy a lot of it. I irritate pollsters like all media guys do. But it's increasingly hard to get a truly random sample because a lot of people don't answer the phone, especially in, denser areas, or it's a young working mom with 2 screaming kids and a job she's balancing. How do you guys do it? There's this whole world of waiting, which I know is tricky business.
Well, first of all, people think that if the response rates are low, you can't get a random sample. That's actually not true. As long as the people who aren't answering are not different from the people who are, it's still a random sample. You have to be able to, in order for it not to be random, you have to show that there's a systematic difference between the people who are answering the phone and the people who aren't. And so far, that hasn't been the case. Even with the very low response rates that we have, those people look almost exactly like the people who do answer the phone. Where they don't, we do have this waiting, as you mentioned, and we've gotten so much better at that, at least on our side of the aisle, because we have, for better or worse, lots of information now about people. We have the voter file. We know which party you're registered in. We know how many times you voted, how many times you haven't voted. We know something about your educational level. We know something about the cars you drive. We know something about lots of things about you. And we can make sure, using all that information, make sure that we have a sample of voters that looks really very much like the electorate as a whole.
Once you know that random sample is well done and you've eliminated the question bias, then you've got a pretty good grip on what's going on.
Absolutely. Now things change.
Right.
I mean, there are people, people come and say all the time, but you had that poll like 6 weeks out and it didn't turn out that way. Well, yes, during that 6 weeks, people are spending millions, sometimes tens of millions of dollars to make it come out differently. So hopefully that's going to have an effect at some point. But the reality is, yes, you should know what's going on at that moment with a great deal of accuracy.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. Also, I think a thing people miss in polling is beware of these one-night snap polls, because there's a thing called quotas, getting enough of each kind of person, so to speak, and that can take time. You got to hunt them down.
That's right. It's a difference between having a poll of people who are easy to reach and a poll of the electorate. If you have a one-night poll, you have a poll of people who are easy to reach by definition. When you call them back 10, 12, 15 times as we do, then you can be pretty sure you're getting a much more accurate
10, 12,
sample.
15 connected to it. So you're the most hated pollster in America in addition to one of the more accurate ones.
Absolutely. That's how we become accurate.
Usually
people aren't answering their phone each of those earlier times. It's not we're calling people back.
No, you got to quote. You're trying to find left-handed Ukrainian or whatever, and or somebody in the demographic.
Sally Smith. And we're going to call her back until we're absolutely sure she doesn't exist at that phone number.
Right. And then you replace her with somebody in the same demographic cohort that would speak for that world. Good polls are expensive because of all that kind of stuff.
Yes, they are.
The average media publisher, when they're not, getting instructions from the liberal Colossus conspiracy somewhere, in which you are a full colonel, by the way, they're cheap.
Colonel?
No, okay. You're a general. No. Yeah, no. Even that was my old joke 10 years ago. Yeah, we're moving up to field marshal now.
I'm a Kentucky colonel.
The media polling tends to be cheaper because they're cheaper. Do you see things in media polls that drive you crazy?
All the time. One of the big differences are the Robo polls, which...
And you should define what that is.
Yeah. That is something that's typically done in 1 or 2 nights, and they just send out electronically a mass of calls, and they see whoever answers, and they grab that as a sample, and then they weight it somewhat magically to come out to the result that they wanted to often.
And they would argue their advantage is because it's so cheap for the robot to do calls, they can do a big brute force thing of zillions of calls, and in one magic night they can get 400 registered voters.
They can, and even more than that, but the reality is it is not as accurate a sample. You don't know who you're talking to. You have no idea who you're talking to.
Yeah, it could be a third grader there pushing buttons.
Exactly. And again, when we're calling somebody with a live caller, we're asking for a specific person. And because of the voter file, we know a lot about that person. They don't even know who they're talking to in that household. Let me say another thing about robopolls. They are legally prevented from calling cell phones. We can say the law is bad, it should be changed, but it is the law. You cannot call a cell phone from a computer. And that means those robopolls who are not calling cell phones are saying there's 40, 50% of the electorate who they're not even interested in talking to. If I stood up and said, I have a poll, but I've excluded 40% of the electorate from it, people would say I'm nuts. But that's exactly what those robo-pollsters are doing, and that wreaks havoc with polls.
What about the analysis of polls? Because there was a New York Times poll, New York Times CBS a few weeks back, and it said, amazing tide. This race is so close. It was Trump 40, Hillary Clinton 40. And I thought, no, this means that the country is regurgitating both candidates because neither of them can get beyond base on the vote. But if you look at the undecided, they look more like Hillary people than Trump people. Trump has more of a ceiling. I thought the analysis was pretty superficial. What kind of mistakes do you see in analysis that are kind of out there in the media at first glance?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I have a ready answer. So
that's the kind of penetrating insights we have here at Radio Free GOP.
Let me vamp for several minutes while I think of something. And this probably will be excised during the editing process. The truth is there's all kinds of mistakes in analysis that people make. First of all, British polls during the up until very recently never included an undecided voter. They just percentage them out of the race, and
really, they would on the ballot question, they'd say, "Are you voting Tory? Or are you voting Labor or Lib Dem or whatever it's called?"
And if you say I'm undecided, they just throw you out. So it would be always add up to 100, 55, 45, 50, 50, 52, 48, which is insane. But the truth is, a lot of analysts act as if there's no undecided voters. I mean, if you're looking at a 40-40 race, you also have 20% undecided. That's going to make all the difference. Right. The fact that they're tied is a lot less interesting than the fact that there's 20% undecided and who are those people and what they're about. But those undecideds often get ignored. That's one kind of mistake that people make. A second kind of mistake people make is not recognizing the process is dynamic. As I said before, people are spending millions, tens of millions of dollars to change things every day, at least every week. And you can't expect them to stay the same. You want to get a sense of what the trajectory is, where are things going, how they're moving. And that's something you can't always tell just from looking at a static number. And I guess that leads me to another point, which is there are two ways of looking at these numbers, both of which are important, both of which are valid, one of which tends to get importantly overlooked or looked at incorrectly at least. You can look at the levels. Is it 40% or is it 45%? But you also look at momentum. Which way are things moving? What direction are things going? For a long time, looked at gay marriage, which was the fastest changing opinion that we've had in this country, at least in the history of polling. And still we had a majority pluralities against gay marriage for a long time, but the trajectory was moving very quickly.
With the demography and the social changes about it. The new views people had. You could see that. Yeah.
And so it was pretty clear before we got to the tipping point that we were getting to the tipping point. And the fact that we were still 5 points or 10 points away from the tipping point was not nearly as interesting as the fact that in a year or two, we were going to get to that tipping point.
It was funny. I bumped into a California political activist some years ago who was very interested in doing an initiative to legalize gay marriage. Do you think you could win? I go, it's already won. Just come back in 4 years.
Yes, exactly.
Take a 4-year vacation, put it on the ballot. It's wait for the thing to turn.
And that is what happened in California. Right. There was one on the ballot that was defeated or passed preventing gay marriage, and now gay marriage is legal everywhere.
When you go onto that webpage that everybody looks at, the realclearpolitics.com polling average, and you look at all the newspaper and media polls, are there one or two or three you kind of go to and think, I believe that one because you know the people who do it or you think they take extra care? Do you have a few favorites you think that people watching this, when they see that poll, that's one to kind of keep an eye on?
Well, first, I do think the averages are important to look at.
Yeah.
Years ago, we did John Kerry's race before there was a 538 and all these. We did that. We looked at averages. We took all the polls, including our own public and private, averaged them together and looked at them on a daily basis separate from our own. Now, our own tended to track them pretty closely, thank God. But the reality is that those averages are important and well worth looking at. Within those, there's obviously some higher quality and lower quality ones. The truth is, the ones the networks do, NBC Wall Street Journal, ABC Washington Post, CBS New York Times, tend to be very good. Pew obviously does a really excellent job with the polling they do. So those are the ones that I tend to give a little bit more weight to. But the reality is you can learn something from almost every one of the polls.
Right.
But
it's good to have the context of others. I've never trusted the Quinnipiac poll because I can't spell it. I'm sure it's excellent, but I still can't figure out how to spell Quinnipiac. Can you?
I'm not sure.
Stump the pollster. You see what I mean? They ought to change it to the Accutron poll or something.
Well, but
make it easier for
like
all
many
of us.
others, they're advertising for their universities. So
right, exactly.
They'd have to change the name of their university to make it worth.
I wonder in the first 30 days how many freshmen there can spell Quinnipiac. That would be the other.
Should be on the test.
Yes, exactly. Now, you've worked all over the world. Why don't you tell us where and how polling might be different in those places?
We have worked all over the world, everywhere from the Philippines and Mongolia to Europe to Israel.
Mongolia. What's the campaign in Mongolia like?
Well, let me tell you, the national drink of Mongolia is fermented horse milk. Oh. Now, I myself never get near fermented horse milk, but one of my colleagues who's a very adventuresome eater drank it, threw it up right away.
Yeah, when was the funeral?
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
It's unusual. But no, look, in some ways, the principles are very much the same. You're trying to get a random sample. You're trying to understand how people are thinking, why they're thinking the way they do, how you might change their opinions. Principles are very much the same, but the campaigns are different. We did races in Colombia where you're not allowed. There's no TV advertising, no advertising of any kind. The only thing you do is we took them off the walls, but you have posters,
right? Sure,
redecorating.
Do they get the party broadcast or nothing?
Nothing. You get party broadcasts and you get big rallies covered on TV.
And they love the big rallies. I once in Central America. We were lined up to do a presidential campaign there, and they brought me in and solemnly explained I was fired because they thought it over and decided to go for a bunch of Mexican laser show guys to do the big rallies because they could smoke the place and put a fighting rooster up in the air. Me, the polls, all the new stuff, we were on the way to the airport because I couldn't beat laser shows at the rally.
Exactly. And in many countries, those rallies are really seen as the device for campaigns.
You want to be the T-shirt vendor. That seems to be we're all in the hats.
You want to be like the water vendor, but because people are there for hours, it's hot. Yeah. But in any event, you go to a country like Israel where you do have the party political broadcast, but you don't have paid advertising on TV or radio, but you can do digital. And we did a campaign where we did really was 100% digital. You can also buy billboards. Those are the things you can do. So the rules are different in different places, and that causes you to do different things in the campaigns. And obviously the issues are different to some extent from place to place, but you'd be surprised just how similar the issues really are.
I went and observed the Sarkozy campaign in France, and they had the same thing. There is literally a guy off a stopwatch.
They had French food.
Yeah, no. I offered to stay a long time there and go in depth in research in Paris. It was beautiful. But there's literally a guy from the government because they're, fraternity equality with a stopwatch, timing all the parties to get equal access in the nightly news. So what the Sarkozy guys did, which was super smart, and I promptly tried to steal it, was they built a website with TV channels. And it was a highly digital campaign, and they just fed through that, and it became the new interesting thing. So it had massive traffic. It was the same kind of deal. They were getting around the limits on how much American-style TV access you could have. But you find the polling is pretty much the same the world over. I did a thing in Eastern Europe once where we were polling in the former Soviet Union not long after, and we had we eventually had to go door to door between the phone infrastructure and the fact that people were nervous. And we had all these credentials and badges on our, to get people comfortable giving an answer that didn't put them in a salt mine a week later, like the old days.
Absolutely. And there are different...
Mark's shaking his head like, what old days? It was the workers' paradise. That's the way you ought to poll, comrade.
Some people need to be re-educated. What can you say? No, look, the reality is, though, in place, there are differences in the method. So in some places, we're doing it on the phone. Some places, we're doing door-to-door to this day. In some places, we're doing a combination of both to get different kinds of people. So it really depends on the place you are and the nature of the infrastructure in that country.
What do you think the future of polling will be? Are we going to have robots calling us that we can't tell are robots? Are we going to have chips in our head that know everything we think? And I mean, what will digital bring? What will the digital revolution bring to polling in the next decade that we don't see now?
I think what we're going to see is both a separation and a confluence of things. Here's where the separation is. We now do our message work and our point estimates, that is, who's winning, who's ahead by how much, who's behind by how much, in the same way, in the same place as we do our message testing. I think over time, those things are going to get divorced from each other. That is to say, we'll have a method for going out and finding out who's ahead and who's behind, and we'll be using mobile platforms, we'll be using the web, we'll be using some traditional phone calls, other things will be sort of mixed together. But we can't do the message testing the in-depth message testing using those kinds of platforms. So we'll have other platforms or other modalities where we'll be doing message testing. And that too will be on the web, perhaps with some mobile, be different kinds of techniques and technologies. So that's one thing that's going to happen. The other thing that's going to happen, things come together, is we're going to have lots of streams of data coming into the campaign, whether it's the polling, the results of the canvas, all these things coming together, and we'll be able to look at them together in a fashion that's going to give us much more information than each stream would independently.
That's what I think. It'll be the massive data inflow in almost real time, and then we'll have to process that information. Some of the pollsters that I work with on the Republican side are experimenting with internet-based polling. What's your view on that? What do you think about that technology?
A lot of folks are moving in that direction. There's certainly evidence that you can have good internet polling, but a lot of it isn't good. And a lot of it isn't good because it's done based on a panel of people who've raised their hand and said, please poll me.
Yeah.
And
I got a lot of opinions.
Exactly.
I don't get enough of my job in the merchant marine spouting off in bars all the time. I want to do a poll too.
Please call me or please email me. So when you're looking at those kinds of audiences, those kinds of polls that are based on those panels of people that have raised their hands, those people who've raised their hands and say, please, I want to give you my opinion, they are different from most people who say, please leave me alone.
Right.
Don't seek out my opinion. So that's the problem we've got. And there are some folks that have gotten better at this. YouGov, for example, a British company that has a large American affiliate, they've gotten pretty good at this as a result of the work of a statistician at Stanford named Doug Rivers, and other people have as well. But you got to view them with those internet polls with some suspicion, particularly the ones that aren't at the highest quality.
So what about focus groups? I spend all my time behind one-way glass yelling at the crowd because it always seems to me to be the same 8 people. There's cab driver with opinions, probably one of those guys raising their hands, or another guy I like to call old merchant marine. I've seen a lot of things. And then there's angry divorcee. And then there's bitter teacher. And then there's young guy staring at young girl across the thing, not listening to any questions. You get kind of I guess it proves the sample, the blood test theory you were talking about earlier to be right. But I find there's a big social value in the groups where they kind of, like I know the one young guy is trying to impress the cocktail waitress across the table, and it seems to take on a life of its own. A good moderator will step in and stop that, but it seems to have that gravity field.
There is the sort of the archetypal personalities that you do run into in these in focus groups. But look, focus groups can be very helpful. They can also be very misleading. It is a way to sort of put some flesh on the bones. I mean, if you looked at just my bones, you wouldn't have a very good picture of what I look like. You need the flesh too, and numbers provide the bones. The focus groups can provide the flesh, so it can be very helpful.
This is like the Hannibal Lecter school of polling here.
Yes,
we got to get a little less vivid analogy, but I get your point.
Dissections, so on, but the reality is focus groups can be very misleading too, partly for the reasons you suggest, but partly also because people don't have access to their own decision-making processes. You can ask people questions about why they're making decisions they do. They will give you answers, but oftentimes those answers have nothing to do with the reality because people really don't know what's influencing them. Right. So you have to use a variety of techniques, but at the same time, again, those focus groups can be highly illuminating in understanding something sometimes very simple that you didn't grasp before, that nobody grasped before, sometimes much more complex insights, but they do allow you to really speak to people in their own words, hear their own concerns, and how they fit information together. And sometimes it's just different than the way other people might fit it together.
But they can be pretty misleading.
They can be misleading, absolutely. And that's why you have to know how to handle them. You have to know how to do them, but also then how to evaluate what you get out of them. It's not a straightforward process. But they can be very misleading.
We're going to have to break that news to Frank Luntz.
You have to do them for them to be misleading.
Yeah, you normally don't do them on network television either, where they have to bring their makeup kit in.
Those are not focus groups. That's just a
TV show.
TV show, yes.
Well, we're in reality politics now, so let's talk a little campaign stuff. We're end the polling seminar. Our audience is now a little more educated on how to be a good polling consumer. You guys in the Democratic side, I'm convinced somewhere in Washington you've got a secret underground room where you go every night just to sit down, crack open a good beverage, and laugh your asses off. Because who would have thunk it? This Trump thing, you're, I'm sure, being prudent campaign consultants, but you got to think, we won a lottery here.
There is that. Look, it's bad for the country. There's no question about it. It's bad for the country in many ways. I mean, even the fact that he's running, even the fact that he's dredged up this kind of vitriolic language, the kind of hatred that's being expressed, it's really bad for the country, and it'll have reverberations, I think, for years to come. But from a purely political point of view, oh my God, how could you guys have been so stupid? It is hard to imagine. And it's hard to imagine, honestly, why that thing we call the Republican establishment didn't intervene much earlier to prevent this from happening. And it leads me to believe that that thing I called the Republican establishment doesn't actually exist. There is no Republican establishment.
Well, I get blamed a lot because I was running the Jeb Bush super PAC. So a lot of people think I should have taken all our money and gone after Trump to help advance the careers of Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz. But you know how the decision-making thing works in this. It's always 1914. You're looking at your interest to get by guys in your lane, and there's never a collective point of view of how to police the primary. So our job was not to elect somebody else. Now, I've said before in the podcast that if I had a time machine, I'd go back in time and convene a meeting with the super PACs for Kasich and Rubio and Cruz if they wanted to show up, and Chris Christie, and say, all right, guys, you each put in $1 million, all four of you, and I'll match you with $4 million. And we can go do something categorical with Trump. And I would bet you dollars to donuts they all would have passed, because the Rubio guys were obsessed with killing Christie in New Hampshire, and the Cruz guys were trying to draft. Nobody ever has that kind of collective view. But I agree. We should have had the Platu Barada Niktu robot show up and try to police the primary. But most of us thought Trump had a cap and wouldn't make it all the way. And we were wrong.
Well, and the campaigns can't be expected to play that role. And that's why one talks about this mythical establishment. I talk about this mythical establishment. I mean, you would think that there are people who are in leadership positions, like Speaker Ryan, like Leader McConnell, like Reince Priebus, others, governors who are in a position to get with the donors who are putting the tens of millions into these super PACs and saying, look, guys, we've got to do something. We can't expect our candidates to do it because they, as you rightly say, have their own interests, and their interest is getting themselves elected.
Right.
But we have an overriding interest in preventing Trump from getting that nomination, and here are some things we can do to affect that, and the truth is it never happened.
A little of it happened late, but way too late and not big enough.
Way too little, yeah.
The organization or the establishment, it is not that organized.
Right.
There really is no central. We're kind of like you guys were in the 70s. We've had our McGovern now. And we'll see if we learn from the lesson or if we just go into warlord rule for 4 years. It's going to be interesting. What's your take right now? I mean, I hate to, make you predict anything in a year with a huge wrong track vote and voters are ornery and, who knows which way they go. But if you had to predict the rest of the campaign, what do you think is going to happen in the presidential race? My view is Trump has to dramatically change the way he's perceived by huge swatches of the electorate, either minorities or college-educated voters, particularly women. And I think that's highly unlikely because I don't think you can change Trump, let alone even get a change of the magnitude he'd need to write the numbers. But I'd be curious for your take as somebody who looks at this data every day.
Nobody has been this far behind at this stage of the game and gone on to win. It just hasn't happened. So you have to bet strongly against Trump. And you're right. Right now, the race is about him. And he is perceived very negatively. You have less than 40% of the people in this country who think he's qualified to hold the office. So the reality is he has to make major changes in the way people perceive him. That's not easy to do. It's not easy to do without a major event. If he were to jump in a raging Potomac River and save a drowning child, okay, that might have some impact. But it takes a major event. If you were to personally stop a terrorist attack in LaGuardia Airport, okay, maybe this would have an impact.
He comes in and out of the private terminal. He doesn't see anybody.
Never been to LaGuardia.
Yeah, exactly.
But it takes those kinds of amazing, unusual situations to affect that kind of change, and he doesn't have that opportunity. And he wouldn't likely use that opportunity because, as you say, he is crazy, and he acts the way he acts because that's how he acts.
All he's got is a knob on, should today be a 50% crazy day or do I take it to 100? That's pretty much the throttle for him, and that's not the way out of this mess.
Look, the other thing that's true, and you mentioned Pat Caddell before. I hate to say something positive about him, but he wrote in I believe it was 1980, wrote a memo to the Carter campaign saying, look, guys, when you come through a primary and you win a primary, you think you're a genius, and it's really a bad problem because the truth is the general election is different.
It's done. It's a new world. You've left to a new planet.
Exactly. And Trump,
Yeah, he
just
doesn't
stands
know.
out as somebody who does not understand that. And he keeps saying over and over again, I won the primary. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. But he does not understand the difference.
Yeah.
And even if he grows to understand it in the next week or two, it's just way too late.
He reminds me of like the guy from the rural southern congressional district running for president or even governor who thinks the only change he needs in the campaign is more bumper stickers and bigger signs. You know,
and
he doesn't
better
understand
media.
Yeah, well, of course.
Yeah.
But he doesn't understand the big change in the world. I think he's just a guy who watches himself on TV on the plane, goes to the rallies, plays off the crowd. He reads the room and tells them what they want to hear and amps it up, and then flies back watching the cable coverage of the rally and gets angry at the reporters and tweets about it and then reset the next day.
Well, I think honestly, I think it may be a little more methodical than that, or it seemed like it, at least during the primary. It seemed like he was getting up, and maybe some of his folks were too, every morning and saying, what are the 5 or 10 things I can tweet out today that are going to be the most outrageous and will get the most attention? And he did that, and he was right more often than he was wrong about what would get attention, and he became the story. And for the primary, that worked very well for him because the stories were all about things that are not embraced by, sound crazy, and aren't embraced by most Americans, but were embraced by, frankly enough, Republicans, that he could win the primary.
No, he was perfect to get his 42% of that microcosm of, a much smaller number of voters in the general election. And that was the resonant chord he had, and now we're paying for it.
Right. I mean, most Americans are not interested in having someone who's crazy as president. There are some Republicans who are, but it's a minority of a minority.
10 days out, I'm willing to sell out and sell him a slogan, crazy times demand a crazy president. That's my big comeback plan for Trump. Big orange ink. So here, you said something earlier I think is important and I think is a key part of the strategy. Hillary's got her own problems. I mean, if we had a less troubled Republican and we weren't in the orange menace business, it'd be a more competitive race, I believe. They'd still have demographic advantages on your side. The electorate tilts more deep, but it would be a different world. She has done a good job, and Trump has done a magnificent job of making the election about Trump. I mean, I'm expecting her to now she's going to be campaigning on the International Space Station, just to leave the planet for a month. No need to get out and get seen. But if you were in a bizarro universe running the Trump campaign, what would you do to try to get the focus back on her and off Trump, other than locking him up in a room somewhere and announce he's gone into a meditation camp?
Well, look, this is the problem. A candidate has to be able to do their job, and this candidate can't do his job. Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton can do her job and does it very well, both as a candidate and as a leader and as a decision maker. But Trump can't do the job, and therefore it's not a question of sort of giving him advice or helping him. He is not capable of doing the job, and that is just absolutely detrimental to any campaign.
And it gets in the way because it's now the preface to anything he says. Crazy candidate Donald Trump today now said, his biography is now unsuitability.
Yes.
And that's the pre-roll to everything he does, which is a hell of a box to be in.
It is. And look, this is a change in the press. I remember Bill Clinton said this to me once, that when John F. Kennedy accused Nixon and Eisenhower of letting a missile gap grow between the United States and the Soviet Union, the press said, Senator Kennedy today accused Vice President Nixon of allowing a dangerous missile gap to grow up with the Soviet Union. And President Clinton said, if in his day, back in the 90s, and it's even more true today, if the press was covering that in the 90s, they would say, in a desperate attempt to revive his flagging campaign, Senator Kennedy today said, well, this about Trump, all the more so. The whole narrative is about how lunatic he is, how obnoxious he is, how dishonest he is, and everything he says but gets prefaced by that, gets in between the commas after his name. He cannot avoid those labels, and they are sticking to him like glue.
Yeah, everything is processed now. I mean, it's really kind of unbelievable. I've always wanted to do a newspaper that covered the press like the Politico covers politics. In a desperate bid to prove to their editors that they're not too old to work in a Twitter universe, Reporter X today wrote this shoddily put together story based on clips and rewriting to do their version of it all, where everything, they cover politics like sports. It's all conflict, coaches, poll, and inside strategy. And you won't have Kamoy and Matsu or the missile gap anymore.
Exactly. And look, to some extent, it's important. Function of journalism gives gives folks an inside sense. But oftentimes, they're writing from their perception of what that sense is, not from
they're in a pack.
reality.
A lot of them are young, not that experienced. They work very hard, but they don't know that much, and they all follow each other on social media, and it becomes a herd of the unknowing. because very few of them have been inside a campaign. I mean, I'm constantly getting calls, well, candidate X did that because clearly that'll send a message into some 8-point carom shot, that has nothing to do. Actually, no, he spilled mustard on his tie. That's why it was green today. There's always this over-analysis, but they never believe it. They think there's a conspiracy and you're lying to them if you tell them, no, it's really not that complicated.
But even with the old reporters in the old days, I remember many years ago during a presidential campaign that will remain nameless, they were like a debate a day in Iowa almost. And one of the most seasoned senior political correspondents called me up one day and said, what do you think about what happened in that debate in Iowa last night? What do you think the impact's going to be? I said, honestly, it will have no impact at all, just like the other.
That's the true answer that they never believe that's often true.
And his response to me was perfect. He said, Mark, I got a job as a newspaper reporter. And my job as a newspaper reporter is to get my story on the front page. If I write nothing important happened last night in Iowa, it's not even getting in the paper, let alone on the front page. So either you tell me what important happened last night, or I'm going to find somebody who will.
Right. I had the same conversation with the great legendary Bob Shulgren of the LA Times.
That's the person I had the conversation
with.
Yeah,
it was, because, he did the same thing with me. He said, kid, listen. It's really simple. They pay me to give them words, okay? So at the end of the day, I'm going to get paid, so they're going to be words. So serve some up, or I got to go interview the waitress down there who's maybe going to say the guy has a funny haircut, and that's the lead.
That is so funny.
And there'll be more words tomorrow. It was him.
It's the same guy.
We've both been to school. He was a great political reporter. Oh, I miss him, and I miss the guys with that kind of level of expertise. So let's do some adventures in polling. I've seen races where polling really makes a difference because a lot of the time the questionnaires are lazy. You find out what you already know. Hey, ice cream's popular, 82%. But really good questionnaires, good poll design, you find out little levers in the electorate that you didn't know were there. And if you got a brave campaign and a smart candidate, you can hang the whole campaign on it. Nickel a week for Engler in 90, was a good example in Michigan. You find the lever and you have the strategic guts to put everything on it. And next thing you know, you get an 18-point move and you're, boom, you win a statewide. I'm certain, had a few of those in your career. Can you think of one or two times where the polling had a strategic insight that might have been a little counterintuitive and led to a good result? A little case study for our folks here?
Well, fortunately, I've got lots of those. If I wouldn't be sitting here.
The brochure here.
But look, go back to that very first race I did. I mentioned earlier in Connecticut. It was 1982. It was the year of Reaganomics. Everybody was running on Reaganomics. And what we found in our district, in the district our candidate was running in, was people didn't really care about that in particular. But we found out they did really care about cutting Social Security. And that was one small piece for most people. It was our whole campaign. The incumbent, Larry DeNardis, voted to cut Social Security. That's all we said. We had only enough money for 10 days worth of ads. That's all we said. And people said, no, you have to go do Reaganomics. You have to do that too. No, we're only doing this. And we came back from about a 30-point deficit to win the race because we put all our eggs in a basket, and it was the right basket.
That is in the strategy business what you're always fighting against, because there's some intuitive thing that most people, the well-intentioned amateurs who surround the campaign, always have the market basket theory. Well, you need a bio spot. You need a job spot. You need an education spot. You need a left-handed voters should be for me spot. You need a mom spot. You wind up having a bunch of kind of pieces, but no whole, no big thing that makes people think, oh, I get it. Vote this, get that. And I think polls often help you know what the thing is that, or I like to call it the new information that if people knew would affect the voting decision.
Exactly. I mean, that's what we're trying to figure out. Of all the things that one could say about oneself, of all the things you could say about your opponent, which are the one or maybe two, because that's all you can get across, but which are the one or two that are going to bring you the most votes. And that's what it's all about. And discovering that in the survey and in the other research is exactly what we're aiming for.
Now, how many times have you had a candidate that doesn't believe in polling? Mark, I know you got your fancy polls and your Yale computer here, but I was out at the service station. That's my poll. How many times you run into that?
Run into it with some frequency. And, look, I mean, and sometimes very famously, Harry Reid, who happens to be a client of ours and very proud to have him as a client for these many years, but he always says he hates polling, doesn't trust it, but that didn't stop him from calling me during his competitive race pretty regularly to find out what the numbers were and what I thought about them.
He didn't believe on them, but he thought he ought to know what they were.
Exactly. But, he's a wonderful guy, but he used to say to me, it was a race where we had us ahead the entire time by exactly the margin we ended up winning by, but every other poll that was done in the race, and there are hundreds of them, had us losing. And He would say, "Are you sure we're ahead?" I said, "Yes, Senator, I'm sure we're ahead." He said, Mark, you got a lot riding on this. And I said, "Yes, Senator, you have even more riding on it than I do." But we
and
both
you were
came
right.
out ahead.
You were well known in the polling business for that call. There's a thing, in every polling presentation, the pollster says, "Oh, okay, we got a 4.4 margin of error, 95 out of 100 cases." And my ear always perks up. 95 out of 100 cases. So there are 5 cases out of 100 where the poll could be totally wrong. Does that ever happen?
Well, first of all, that's not exactly true. In other words, that's how people understand that, but that's not really what it means. What it means is there's a bell curve to that error.
Right.
And so the chances that it's way off are actually infinitesimally small. And there's a pretty good chance that it's only 3 points off. And a decent chance it's only a point or 2 off. And the chances that it's way off, just crazy off, extremely small.
But have you ever been there and you
just
open
based
up
on the statistics?
You open up the data book and think, this one seems a little, I wonder if it was party night in the phone bank, or do you ever have that, the thousands of polls you've done kind of,
Oh, yes. And we run, it's like a crazy Madhouse here when that happens, because we strip it all down. It's like going to a automobile race and they're stripping the whole car down. We're going back to every basic. How do we do the sample?
Right. Take it apart.
Who did we call? Who did we not call? Let's look at all the data, all the information we can, sort of strip it down to each part and say, where did we make a mistake? And more often than not, the answer is we didn't make a mistake. Things just look different than we expected. But occasionally there's a problem.
Yeah. And then you just go
back and redo it.
Do it again. What has been a good experience in your candidate life where you had to give them really contrary information? Like, I'm going to run this whole campaign on cupcakes, Mark. That's always what's worked here in Maine. The cupcake thing is the thing. You Washington consultants don't get all that. And you've talked to 500 people in the district, so you know pretty well what they do think. What's a great story? You don't have to use names, but I've had a couple of those where the poll was a reality check.
You have the people that assume they are very popular and very well liked, some of whom aren't well known and some of whom aren't well liked. You have people who, and I've certainly had those, and you have to go tell them. I mean, this didn't happen in the U.S., but I was the person that had to go and tell Eduard Shevardnadze, a world historical figure, that he was the most unpopular political figure in the world at that point. I mean, his favorables were down to about 2. It's sort of like the level of African-American vote that Donald Trump is getting these days. And that's how the whole country
He'll be here all week, folks. That's a tip your server.
But here's a guy who played a really significant role in history in the breakup of the Soviet Union, was the president of Georgia. Anyway, I went and I was supposed to meet with him for an hour. I got about 10 minutes of information out. And then for the next 2.5 hours, he explained to me that he was a world historical figure, and this could not possibly be true, nor even if it was true, couldn't possibly be actually relevant to anything because of his status as a world historical figure.
In the old days, you'd be in a cell. Well, there's a great Finkelstein story of lore. Arthur's never told me this directly, but it sounds about right, which is he was presenting a poll to a well-known Southern senator, and he said, and then you have, and this was a fairly polarizing figure, and then we found that your unfavorable rating was 42%. And the eyes look up, the senator gives him the piercing glance. What does that mean? Well, it means we surveyed people. How many you call? Well, we surveyed 800 people, and 372 or 41% gave you an unfavorable rating. And the senator looked at him. So you called all these people, and 378 of them told you they had an unfavorable opinion of me. I would like a list of names.
I've had that request. Definitely. I want to talk to those people.
Yeah, straighten them out. Well, Engler did that. Remember that?
I was going to say, a famous focus group, famous for me at least, where we're doing an initiative. We were working together.
Yep.
And
a Michigan statewide initiative where the Dems and Republicans come together on school reform.
And Governor Engler was sitting in the back and said, I'm going to go in and talk to these people after we're done. Because he thought it was an initiative that sort of sold itself and nobody actually was for it.
It was a great focus because we're in like Macomb County. And Macomb County, North Detroit focus groups are famous for being plain spoken. And they were talking on and on in there. It was a bad night. We're trying all that. Well, what if you knew it made cereal taste better? And no, it's like the kid throwing the food back in your face. And you're trying every push we've got and they're not buying any of it. And my phone rings. I'm sitting there thinking about, is the bar going to be open after the groups? And it's Engler who just finished, some Chamber of Commerce dinner. So how's it going? How's it going? A little bumpy, John. All right, I'm not far away. I'll be right. No, what? Hello, click. And Engler was a great Paul, kind of old school. I'll never forget in his first race, watching him work a parade in the soaking rain where the brochures disintegrated as he handed them to people. But, he hit 1,000 people on the parade. That's why John Engler came from 19 points back to win the governorship. Anyway, years later, there we are. You're trying to get these people to not hate this thing. They hate it. Engler shows up, sits down, watches him for 2 seconds. I'm going in there. And I'm like, Governor, that is against every, respected rule of the august polling presentation. All right, I'll go in afterward. And the minute you ended, and they're all saying like, Engler, that piece of crap. I hate that jerk. They're just, and then the door opens.
And the governor walks in and sits down. These people have already been sitting here for 2 hours, mind you, going through this discussion. They're shocked, as was I.
And he started working on them like the old state legislature
one
used
by
to be,
one.
one by one, going around the
Starting
table.
person next to him.
What do you need?
What's wrong with this as far as you're concerned? What can I tell you to change your mind? Yeah. Okay, next. Went around the table one by one. It was another hour and a half.
Yeah, no, they couldn't get out.
People couldn't leave.
And
they were amazed. Their governor was sitting with them for an hour and a half.
It was like Johnny Carson just walked in. They were talking about him.
Exactly.
And the door opened. There he is. They were like, this is unbelievable. And he told me going in, I'll bet you for everyone I can convert, you got to write a personal check for $500 to the initiative. And then in he goes. And he got like 5 of them. I remember I was the only personal donor to the darn thing. Yeah. I had to write like a $2,500 check. But yes.
But that was an amazing experience.
And then we got slaughtered in the referendum.
Yes, exactly. It did not sell itself.
I always thought Engler should get some kind of award from the polling council for his, aggressive behavior.
Or some kind of fine.
Yeah, I don't think we ever turned you in. We buried it. We can talk about it now after polling scandal rips apart Michigan. What is your prediction as the man who sees the numbers of something that'll happen on Election Day this year that'll be unexpected? It could be Trump keeps his promise to carry New York, though I'm betting against that one. It would be maybe a House or Senate huge upset or surprising loss. What do you think will be a potential shocker on Election Day?
Well, it's interesting. These days, there's very few things that are total shockers because there's a lot of polling that goes on. But I think there's Senate races in Kentucky and North Carolina that are not very much on anybody's radar that really could produce very substantial upsets.
Yeah, North Carolina is starting to get on the radar.
Yeah.
I think the cavalry is hearing about maybe time to pay some attention there on the Repub side. I've got some nut on the internet from Tennessee who keeps tweeting at me that I'm missing the big picture because every internet poll where you just click, on the internet for somebody shows Trump with an incredible lead. Now, I told him if he's so sure Trump's going to win, he should take all his possessions, sell them, fly to England and bet it all on Trump, and he can show us all we're wrong. But people do tend to believe these polls where you just click on like the newspaper website and they see 4,000 people voted. Can you help me explain to this guy who may not be a listener why that's wrong, why those are not real polls?
It's wrong for a lot of reasons. First, it's a non-random sample. It's the people who are mad enough, who are interested enough to go and check the box on the web. And it's people who have access to the web, and it's people who watch that television station that tells them to go to that website. So it's a completely non-random sample. Second, he's living in Tennessee. And Tennessee is going to go for Trump, I'd bet. Maybe not by a huge margin, but maybe. So that's not going to tell you much about
everybody he bumps into every day is for Trump.
For Trump, yes.
So he's like, hey.
Well, even more, the state is probably going to go for Trump. But if you look at this, people tend to associate with people who are like them.
Right.
And who think like them. So everybody he does run into every day, most of them, probably are Trump supporters.
So it's a landslide.
Among his friends, I have no doubt.
It's like the Pauline Kael joke about Manhattan. Everybody I know is from McGovern. He can't lose.
Exactly.
Is there a way people can follow you on that social media the kids like?
Yes, I'm on Twitter at Mark Mellman, oddly enough.
Alrighty. Well, I want to see some provocative polling tweets. Mark, thank you very much for
Thanks
doing
so
Radio
much,
Free GOP.
A great pleasure.
Mike Murphy, podcasting sanity.
That's our conversation with Mark Mellman. And before we end, I wanted to add a personal footnote. Bob Shogan, the legendary Los Angeles Times political reporter we both spoke about, who it turns out straightened out 2 cocky young political consultants about how the media really works, sadly passed away in 2013 at the age of 83. After he retired from journalism, Bob became a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. As a tribute to our old friend, we're posting on our RadioFreeGOP.com website a link to a video taken at a C-SPAN book appearance where Bob discussed one of his many books. This is a favorite of mine, No Sense of Decency, the U.S. Army McCarthy Hearings. It seems apropos of our times, and you'll get a glimpse of Bob Shogan in action. I think you may enjoy it. Well, there are the sirens closing in. The Orthodoxy Police is on patrol here in Washington, D.C., but the Republican resistance is growing. We have supporters everywhere in places where you'd least expect it. In fact, we're heading off to a new undisclosed location deep inside the basement of the Republican National Committee. We're everywhere. This is Mike Murphy. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. And remember, in the end, victory will be ours.
This has been Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance, with your host, Mike Murphy.